My name is Claire. And I didn't cry when my father died. Not at first. I stood there in the sterile hospital room, listening to the beeping machines slowly flatline. And I felt nothing. Not because I didn't love him. God knows I did. But because the last words spoken to me in that room weren't from him. They were from my stepmother. She turned to me, as the silence fell, and hissed through clenched teeth. You're useless, Claire. You couldn't even give him peace in his final moments. You were a burden in his life, and you'll always be one. And I just stood there, frozen, because even though I was 26, those words pierced like I was still 10 years old, clutching a backpack, and hoping she'd hug me when I came home from school. But she never did. And that day, at my father's deathbed, I realized she never would. When I was 12, my mom died in a car crash. I don't remember much from the funeral, except gripping my dad's hand so tightly that my knuckles turned white. We were just two broken pieces trying to survive. 2 years later, Dad brought home her. Her name was Vanessa. She wore too much perfume and smiled too wide. At first, I thought she was trying. She bought me a pink sweater for my birthday and took me to a salon once. But it faded fast. She never hit me. But somehow, the bruises from her words lasted longer than anything else. Stop slouching. No wonder you don't have any friends. Maybe if you were prettier, your dad wouldn't look so sad all the time. My dad, he tried. He did. But he was also tired, grieving, and maybe a little too desperate for someone to fix the emptiness left by my mom. Vanessa made him smile again. So I stayed quiet. Even when she started hiding the letters my mom had written me. Even when she told my dad I didn't want to go to college, that I wasn't cut out for it. Even when she called me a mistake she didn't sign up for. The cancer came quickly, 6 months from diagnosis to hospice. And through it all, I was the one at every chemo session, taking notes, feeding him spoon by spoon when he could no longer hold a fork. Vanessa, she came in for the photo ops, posted a filtered selfie next to his hospital bed with the caption, "My love, my fighter." But when the nurses left, so did her smile. She rolled her eyes at his moans, complained about how hospice lighting made her look pale, snapped at me when I adjusted his blanket wrong. I tried not to hate her. I really tried. But the day he was slipping in and out of consciousness, the day he squeezed my hand for the last time, she leaned over and spat out her final venom. If he hadn't had to raise you alone, maybe he'd still be healthy. You sucked the life out of him, Claire. And I almost believed her. Until he spoke. His voice was hoarse, dry, but clear. Claire, drawer, blue folder. I froze. Vanessa rolled her eyes. But I rushed to the nightstand, pulled open the drawer. And there it was. A blue folder, labeled in his familiar handwriting. For Claire. Final wishes. Vanessa scoffed. Please. Probably just a thank you letter or some old sketch. But when I opened it, her face drained of color. Because inside were 3 letters. One for me, one for his lawyer, and one addressed to Vanessa. My hands trembled as I read mine. It wasn't just a letter. It was an explanation. A confession. He knew. All of it. He knew what she'd done. What she'd said. He apologized for not protecting me sooner. He wrote that everything, the house, his savings, his shares, his vintage record collection, was being left to me. Because in his words, you were the one who stayed. The one who loved without asking. You were the daughter I was proud of, even when I didn't say it out loud. Vanessa snatched the folder from my hands, frantic. She ripped open her envelope. And then she screamed. A high-pitched, raw scream, echoing through the hallways of that quiet hospice ward. It wasn't grief. It wasn't love. It was the scream of someone who had just realized they lost not just a man, but a fortune. Because Dad hadn't just left her nothing. He'd left her a letter too. One short sentence. Vanessa, you were the mistake I made trying to forget real love. And that was when I finally cried. Not because he was gone, but because I finally felt seen. I walked out of that hospice room with shaking hands, and a letter pressed against my chest like armor. Dad was gone. But somehow, in that moment, it felt like he had finally come back for me. Vanessa didn't chase after me. She stood there, stunned, clutching her letter like it might change if she stared hard enough. But it wouldn't. He had meant every word. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The funeral was small. Just close friends, a few of Dad's old coworkers, and distant relatives I barely recognized. Vanessa wore a black hat with a veil, like she was auditioning for a movie about mourning. She cried loudly, too loudly, and kept glancing at the people around her to make sure they were watching. When it was over, she cornered me outside by the oak tree where Dad used to take me for picnics. Her voice was low, controlled. "You think this is over?" she whispered, smiling for the people walking past. He was confused, sick. "I'll contest that will and bury you with legal fees. You think you're smart? You're not. You're nothing." I stared at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't shrink. "Then I guess I'm nothing with a lawyer," I said. And I walked away. In the weeks that followed, I moved back into Dad's house. My house now. The same walls where I had tiptoed through teenage years, afraid to breathe too loudly. I repainted the kitchen yellow, Mom's favorite color. I pulled out old photo albums Vanessa had shoved into the attic and filled the hallway with them. I even found a voice message from Dad on an old phone, telling me to drive safe, kiddo. And I played it sometimes when the house felt too quiet. The lawyer called. The will was airtight. Dad had signed it in front of witnesses. There was no loophole. But Vanessa, she didn't let go so easily. One afternoon, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, she was standing there in heels too tall for the gravel driveway, holding a small box. "You forgot this," she said, holding it out. I took it. It was an old jewelry box of my mother's, one I hadn't seen in years. "Why do you have this?" I asked. She smiled. "Oh, Claire. Sweet, forgettable Claire. Your father wasn't perfect, you know. He kept secrets too." And then she left. Inside the box was a flash drive. I hesitated. I didn't want to know. But curiosity, it's a dangerous thing. I plugged it in. There were pictures. Emails. One from years ago. An email Vanessa had sent to a realtor, asking about moving, as soon as the old man's out of the picture. One where she laughed about how Claire will probably end up like her mother, dead or depressed. I stared at the screen, nausea rising. This wasn't just emotional abuse. This was planned, cold, calculated. She hadn't just hated me. She had targeted me. I took it all to the lawyer. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he said, "You want to go public with this?" I didn't. Not yet. But I wanted her to know I could. So I sent her a message. One line. "Keep pushing. And this goes to every contact you've ever had." Her response. Radio silence. She didn't show up again. Not for weeks. Until one rainy Thursday morning. I woke up to find my car windows smashed and the words liar scratched into the paint. I didn't call the cops. I called her. "You're losing control," I said. Her voice cracked. "He was supposed to love me. You were supposed to be nothing." "But I'm not," I whispered. "Not anymore." 6 months later, I started a foundation in Dad's name, helping young girls who've been emotionally abused in their homes. I tell them they're not alone. That healing isn't a straight line, but it's possible. Sometimes I still hear Vanessa's voice in my head, calling me useless. But it fades. Because louder than that, I hear my father's voice. "You were the one who stayed. The one who loved without asking." And now I stay. For myself. For others. Not because I have to, but because I finally know. I am not useless. I am unstoppable. 3 months after my father's funeral, I found myself standing in the middle of my living room, barefoot on the cool wooden floors, staring at the empty walls. The echoes of a past life still hung in the corners. The quiet sobs I used to stifle in my pillow. The way I tiptoed past the kitchen hoping not to be noticed. And Vanessa's sharp voice slicing through the silence like a blade. I thought winning the legal battle, securing the house and my father's final wishes would be enough. But the victory tasted hollow. Freedom, it turns out, is not a destination. It's a slow unlearning. A gentle peeling away of everything you were told you are. Until you find what's real underneath. In that stillness, I started writing. Not for anyone else, just for me. The words poured out in the early hours, full of jagged truths and raw memories I had never dared to name. One day, I submitted an anonymous story to a small trauma survivor's blog. I didn't expect anyone to read it. I definitely didn't expect a letter. It came in a plain white envelope, postmarked from a nearby town. Inside was a note written in careful, shaky handwriting. I read your story. I'm 17. My stepmom tells me I'm worthless every day. I've started to believe her. But then I saw your words. If you survived, maybe I can too. Please don't stop sharing. There was no name, just a return address. But that letter shook something loose in me. I wasn't just healing. I was becoming someone who could offer healing. A week later, I drove out to that town. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, just that I had to try. Her name was Jenna. She was slight, with big brown eyes that carried a weariness far beyond her years. We met at a public library. She sat across from me, arms crossed, voice barely above a whisper, and said, "She tells my dad I lie. That I steal. That I'm just like my mother who ran away. I don't even know what my mother was like." I listened. That was all I could do. And sometimes listening is everything. When she asked, "Do you think I'm broken?" I looked her in the eye and said, "No, honey. You're not broken. You're bleeding. And that's not the same thing." From that day, I became her person. We met weekly. I connected her with a social worker I trusted. When the time came, I helped her gather enough courage and evidence to speak up. Jenna was placed with a foster family who welcomed her like she'd always belonged. She sent me pictures of her new room, decorated with fairy lights, and her own bookshelf. The first thing she bought with her allowance was a journal. She told me she writes now too. And just like that, something shifted inside me. The girl who once hid under her covers from the storm became a shelter for someone else. That was my father's real legacy. Not the house, not the money, not even the final wishes he left on that piece of paper. It was the strength he finally gave me to stand tall, to be seen, to give what I never received. As for Vanessa, she left the state. The lawyer told me she tried to appeal, but the court shut her down hard. I never heard from her again. Sometimes I wonder where she is, if she ever thinks of me, if she feels regret. But then I remind myself, closure isn't something you get from the people who hurt you. It's something you claim for yourself when you stop waiting for them to apologize. A year after my father passed, I opened a community center in his name. I called it the Yellow House, after the warm yellow kitchen I had painted in those first fragile days of grief. It wasn't much, just a safe space for teens dealing with emotional abuse, but it grew faster than I expected. People started showing up, quiet at first, unsure but hopeful. And I told them what I wish someone had told me years ago. You're not crazy. You're not weak. You're not too sensitive. What happened to you wasn't love. And you get to start over. Sometimes I sit in that yellow room, surrounded by laughter, stories, tears, and the brave hearts who refuse to stay silent. And I smile. Not because it's easy, but because I made it. I survived the fire. And now I light candles for others in the dark. I was called useless. Now I am proof. And that's all I'll ever need to be.